Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Good morning, everyone. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Michael Fenster here today, all the way from the west coast of Florida. Came up to get a little taste of the cold weather. He's a board-certified interventional cardiologist and a professional chef. He served on the faculty of the University of Virginia and currently serves with the University of Montana. He has participated in numerous clinical trials as well as published original cardiovascular research that has appeared in peer-reviewed scientific and medical journals. Starting as a dishwasher in college, he worked his way up through the kitchens to the rank of executive chef. He went back to culinary school, achieving a culinary degree with honors. In addition to clinical practice, Dr. Fenster writes, speaks, and lectures worldwide on food and health. He co-directed, in conjunction with the American Culinary Federation, where he presented at their national meeting, and the University of Virginia, an educationally accredited program for health professionals, culinary professionals, and the lay public. He serves as a national contributor to Fox News, amongst many other outlets, and his latest book on ancient cuisines will be released in spring of 2016. We look forward to your comments on red meat or no. Dr. Fenster.
Thank you so much. Can everybody hear me okay? And if not, I'll just yell louder. I said I'm on East Coast time. I've had coffee, so I'm all ready to go. I'm honored to be here. I'm already looking forward to coming back, hopefully for a spring or summer program. But there's a lot of exciting things happening right now, certainly on the food front. I'm sure a lot of you follow that. All you have to do is turn on the TV, go to the newsstand. Certainly a lot happening in health, lots of new information, new challenges. We have new guidelines this year. But we still have some old questions to answer. With the latest guidelines now recommending and abandoning recommendations for dietary cholesterol intake, no specifics regarding fat intake, it brings up a persistent, and I might add from a culinary standpoint, absolutely delicious question. What about red meat consumption and cardiovascular disease? Is that steak a source of powerful sustenance, nutritious and delicious, or is it a down payment on an angioplasty? Because when we consider cholesterol, fat, and particularly saturated fat, we invariably open, if not a can of worms, a can of red meat. So, which I brought along. Does anyone, and I'd just like to say, a show of hands, does anyone actually remember this or know who this guy is? So let me just see a show of hands for, oh, this is not, okay. This isn't working, by the way. There we go. So there are a few here who are not afraid to show their age. Hector. For those who don't, this is Ettore Biordi, also known as Chef Boyardee. And for a generation of Americans, he was, and for some still is, the face of Italian cuisine. For some, he is, for a generation, what this guy is today, Guy Fieri. Because, you know, nothing says real, authentic, wholesome Italian cuisine like Johnny freaking Garlic's. And on a serious note, when we talk about protein and fat, particularly saturated fat, nothing says that like good old-fashioned red meat. Now, the cornerstone of dietary therapy for years in this country, for generations, for decades, has been that the saturated fat in butter, in cheeses, and in red meats should be avoided because it's going to clog our arteries, at least according to the conventional wisdom and the mainstream media. But the story of red meat is the story of protein and fat. And that story is the story of how
will find you acting on your best behavior. Turn your back on Mother Nature. Everybody wants to rule the world.
and our story begins before any human ruled anything. We have to go way back to our origins. At a point where I like to dispel what I refer to as the vegan myth. That somehow long ago in land far, far away, our ancestors dwelled in treetops, eating fruit, nibbling on roots, occasionally frolicking with unicorns. Because the reality of it is that they lived in a very violent Pleistocene world that was much more like Planet of the Apes than it was Curious George. So along with fruits and vegetables, and probably actually lots of insects, they consumed fish and meat. And we can see that this desire to proactively procure meat in our relatives, the chimps today, who are out here now hunting to acquire that very important
The males are the
red meat.
first to eat. They supplement the flesh with a few leaves, just as humans take vegetables with their meat.
Ah, meat and veg, the cornerstone. Cornerstone in the restaurant industry for sure. You know, in fact, our digestive systems are very unique, and they reflect our very unique diet. Carnivores generally have shorter digestive tracts and and shorter colons that we somewhat mirror. But unlike carnivores, our stomachs tend to be on the smaller side. We have a smaller gastric transit time. But we do have a greater short intestine to long intestine ratio, which again makes our setup much more akin to a carnivore than an herbivore. And even compared to other primates, we have less colonic length. And this is important because we have less colonic transit time, and it affects the gut microbiome. Now, affecting the microbiome affects fermentation, energy extraction, a host of regulatory and immune functions. And that's something that we'll touch upon just a little bit later. Now, as a species, we also have significantly reduced tolerance to plant toxins and things like tannins. The reason being that contrary to popular belief, plants don't like to be eaten either. So over millions of years, they have developed an array of biochemical defenses that were much less adroit at exploiting than our more primitive relatives. So we in turn have developed an exceptional physiology, very unique, to adapt to our omnivorous diet. And it's also a diet that is extremely unique in its utilization of cooked food. The result is a distinctly human gut microbiome that has co-evolved to co-metabolize this diet with us. And the result of all the interplay of these forces is evolution. So easy, even a caveman can do it. Our evolutionary success sits on a tripod that is fueled by fire, fat, and protein. Fatty acids, fats are necessary for life. That's why some of them are called essential fatty acids. We also need protein to supply us with essential amino acids. And we see the necessity of these foods by their absence. Deficiency syndromes like essential fatty acid deficiency syndrome, which I have to say as a side, in all the research, you know, doctors and scientists, we're quite a bright bunch in general, but totally unimaginative when it comes to naming things. So the dearth of essential fatty acids is essential fatty acid deficiency syndrome. There are some more creative names like kwashiorkor, which one has adequate energy, usually in terms of carbohydrates, but insufficient protein. And syndromes like marasmus, in which there's not enough protein and not enough energy in terms of total calories. These are one of the protein energy malnutrition syndromes, or PEMS. Conversely, carbohydrates are not essential for life, as long as one acquires the needed nutrients from another source. There is no evidence for any known human carbohydrate deficiency syndrome. As Harold Draper, who is a noted biochemist and scholar, noted, there are no essential foods, only essential nutrients. So when you hear these things being advertised as miracle diets, you got to have this super berry, you know, I think the words for those are caveat emptor. Fire is a critical component of this triad because it really changed the equation. Unlike other animal species, we use fire to cook our food. And the use of fire dates back at least about 500,000 years, but probably likely more to 2 to 4 million years ago. And for the first time ever when we did that, an animal was now processing its food, if initially just thermally. Now, processing and refining food leads to greater energy extraction. This is one reason why the caloric interpretation of food is so worthless, because it does not account for the efficiency of energy extraction. And to give you an idea, there was an experiment done in which mice were given the food that was made of the same components, The only difference was some was thermally processed, some was highly refined. The mice that ate the processed and refined foods always gained more weight. So the result of this triumvirate is that we became much more efficient as biological machines. We had energy dense, we had energy due to fire and energy from energy dense fat. We had the raw materials due to protein and fat consumption from foods like red meats. With this in place, we were able to develop the brain power to make us the smartest guys and gals on the planet. And we still need fats to maintain that edge. We may be intelligent, but everyone in this room is a fathead. About 25% of the body's total cholesterol, a molecule so important that is required for every cell to function correctly. About 25% of the body's cholesterol is in the brain, where it serves an integral role in insulating the myelin sheaths for proper neuron-to-neuron communication. And if we take the water out, about 60% of the dry weight of the brain is in fats. Behind all this cerebral success is carnivory. So if we see from our story, the consumption of red meat was one of the drivers for success as a species. How the heck did we wind up at a place where we're questioning whether or not we should even be consuming it at all? How did we find ourselves on this road to nowhere hundreds of thousands of years later and well into our modern age? Well, anytime I have a question about where we are in our modern society, I always look to the decade of disco and directives, the 1970s. And indeed, we are going to find our answer here. We've just got to pick up the story a little bit earlier. So it turns out that after eons, if not longer, of evolution, fueled by fire, fat, and protein, problem was identified. Now on the left, you'll see Ansel Keys, who was on the cover of Time magazine in 1961. And he received widespread praise at this time for identifying a significant health problem related to fat, saturated fat, and cholesterol as a specific cause of cardiovascular disease. Now I've juxtaposed him with the cover of the same magazine over 50 years later, questioning whether we got that all wrong. Did we? I heard somebody back there. You're right. Hold on. So following World War II, Ansel Benjamin Keys observed previously unseen rise in the United States in cardiovascular disease, morbidity, and mortality. He noticed that this was not present in Europe. And he hypothesized that the reason was the increased consumption of saturated fat in the United States, the so-called cholesterol hypothesis. And he presented his initial findings at a conference in Naples in 1955, where surprisingly, it was actually not very well received at all. So Keys went back, he did his homework, and he published his findings in the seminal 7-country studies. Looked at about 13,000 men from Japan, the United States, Europe, and other places around the world. And it demonstrated compelling evidence between increasing consumption of saturated fats, cholesterol, cardiovascular morbidity, and mortality. And you can see that from the data here. And look who's number one on the chart, USA, USA, USA. The highest consumption of saturated fat and the most deaths from coronary artery disease. You can see there are multiple cohorts from each of the 7 countries, and the lowest consumption of saturated fats, lowest cholesterol levels, lowest death from coronary heart disease in the Japanese and Mediterranean cohorts. This data, if you've ever had to work in a lab and put data together, and you get a line like this, you're very excited. This is definitive data. This is impressive, it's powerful, it's compelling, maybe a little bit too compelling. We'll never know the answers because dead men tell no tales. And apparently they do not get their cholesterol checked either. Keys took these answers with him to the grave. Because you see, at the time of the 7-country studies was done, there were countries that were studied in which the data did not fit the hypothesis, but were left out of the present final paper. Norway, where cholesterol consumption was high, but heart disease was left out of the study. Chile, where saturated fat consumption was low, but heart disease was high, was left out of the study. All in all, there were about 22 countries in the 7 countries studied. Countries like France, where decades before we named the French paradox, it was in existence. And maybe it wasn't such a paradox, because if we look at other neighboring countries like Switzerland, at that time West Germany, as far north as Sweden, we see where saturated fat consumption was high, heart disease was low. Even the basis for the Mediterranean diet was flawed data. And this was just reported by some researchers on Crete in a 2002 paper. You see, the Mediterranean diet is based primarily on the Cretan diet. Following World War II, that island was terribly hard hit by the war. So the diet that people were eating was significantly affected by this in the post-war years. Also, some of the dietary data was collected during Lent. When you have a very large Christian Orthodox population, Lent can skew your nutritional data points. So in 1961, besides being on the cover of Time magazine, Keyes had a prominent position in the American Heart Association Nutrition Committee. And at that time, they released the first ever saturated fat guidelines for the country. And this instituted a push for the government to get involved, which it did in the early 70s, and establish some national guidelines for us. And this huge political movement came to fruition in 1977, being led by presidential candidate and then Senator George McGovern. And it put forth guidelines, recommendations for sodium, for salt, for fat. And this has resulted in another blast from the past. Anybody remember the infamous food pyramid? Now this food pyramid started blocking our foods into certain groups and then institute a regimen of approaching food in these groups. This called for over 55 to 60% of our daily energy coming from carbohydrates. Most of those refined carbohydrates. They want you to eat more Wonder Bread than even vegetables or fresh fruit. Fats were limited to 30%, sat fat limited to 10%. Cholesterol intake was limited to 300 milligrams. To give you an idea, one egg is anywhere from 175 to 200 milligrams. Sugar limited to 15% of daily energy, and sodium intake set at 3 grams per day. The rationale behind such an approach to sanction certain food groups and not others was, as Harvard nutritionist Mark Hegsted said in 1977, not based on a question of why we should do this thing, but why not? People will reap important benefits. And the risks, and I quote, none can be identified. Really? Not everyone was on board. It was actually quite contentious back in the late 70s, particularly from certain corners of the medical community. Professor Yudkin implored the powers that be that the real culprit here was not fats and saturated fats, but carbohydrates and refined sugar. Professor Olson, who was actually chairman of the dietary committee, during the hearings had a heated exchange with Senator McGovern. And he said, and I quote, "I pleaded in my report and will plead again here orally for more research on the problem before we make recommendations to the American public." And the senator replied, and I quote, "Senators don't have the luxury that the research scientist does of waiting until every last shred of evidence is in." Wow. Wow. That is some kind of philosophy to have when you are implementing a national health policy that affects every single individual and their children in a most intimate way by impacting their health. Well, here's the results of said policy implementation. This is the prevalence of obesity in the United States from the 60s up. And the red arrow marks where there was implementation of these dietary guidelines. And you can easily see the change in the curve and the rate of rise in the slope. And in the inset, you can see the parallel curves. It doesn't matter what your age was, doesn't matter what the sex was. Now in 2015, over 50 years later, at least the new dietary guidelines are beginning to acknowledge some of these past errors. As Professor Nestle opined, in the previous decades, we treated fat as the primary harm. This anti-fat stance was never grounded in science. The reality of it, folks, Fat doesn't make you fat, and it doesn't make you diabetic. Dr. Listick has observed that this advice to eat more carbs and avoid fat is exactly backwards if you want to improve health and lower body weight. The new guidelines specifically avoid any cap on the overall fat intake in the diet. Yet it still calls for a limit of 10% unsaturated fat. So what is the evidence for that? Well, if we go back, we find ourselves back to Keyes. It goes to his observation that heart disease tended to be related to the serum cholesterol, that in turn tended to be related to the saturated fat. But as we all know, correlation is not causation. 10% fat recommendation was adopted in the US in 77, in the UK a little bit later in 83. It was based on 6 trials at the time. 5 of them were secondary prevention trials, meaning most of the people in these trials were already sick. The total of all 6 trials together, less than 2,500 people. All of them male, most of them middle-aged and Caucasian. Not one trial, and I know you may find this hard to believe, but it is not a word of a lie. The data and the references are available, because when I first came across this, I had to go back and look at, I couldn't believe it. Not one trial of the 6 actually tested the recommendations as they were proposed. Even more intriguing, there was no statistically significant difference in mortality or cardiovascular mortality between the 2 groups. Now, the treated group, the intervention group, did have statistically lower levels of serum cholesterol. I'm going to let that sink in for a minute. So in essence, what we have is that the data at the time used to promote the low fat, 30% of total, low saturated fat, 10% of total, showed the exact opposite, that a dietary approach lowering cholesterol did not result in any kind of mortality benefit overall or cardiovascular. Despite no documented efficacy and no trials that actually tested the recommendations, dietary policy was put forth that affected over 275 million people at the time between the United States and the UK. All of this based on at best specious results from less than 2,500, mostly sick, male, middle-aged Caucasians. Now, despite the lack of vetting, Americans actually listened. From the institution of this in the 70s through 2000s, Americans significantly reduced their consumption of fat, and in particular, saturated fat. But this obsession with fat has resulted in what I term the lipid distraction. As we focused on fat, the rise in diabetes and other inflammatory disabilities and diseases has skyrocketed, paralleling the rise in obesity on the curve that I showed you earlier. And the role of fats, well, that was confined to looking at lipid profiles in a test tube. We made little effort at that time to understand the physiology or their biochemical importance. For example, it was little appreciated, and I think it is actually still very little appreciated fact today, that the primary reduction one sees in LDL cholesterol that accompanies a reduction in dietary saturated fats tends to be a decrease in the large, buoyant, or type A LDL pattern. Consuming saturated fat actually correlates with a reduction in the small, dense, or type B LDL pattern. Now remember, when we refer to LDL cholesterol, when it comes back on a test, we are simply looking at the quantity of cholesterol in the low density lipoprotein, or LDL fraction. It's giving us a quantitative number. It says nothing about the quality of that. How is it used? For example, if I have a pound of plastic, I can make a few big beach balls, type A, buoyant LDL pattern, or I can make a whole lot of marbles, small, dense, type B LDL pattern. And we know that it is the small, dense LDL pattern that is associated with the development of coronary disease, found in metabolic abnormalities like metabolic syndrome and diabetes. And it's believed that the number the amount of small dense LDL particles are important because the egress of that from the bloodstream into the vascular wall, where it may participate in atherosclerosis and inflammation, is a gradient-driven process. Not surprising, there are any number of studies that we can look at that fail to show a correlation between saturated fat intake and the risk of developing cardiovascular disease. Here is a meta-analysis of 21 studies by Siri Tarani, who found that, and I quote, "There is no significant evidence for concluding that dietary saturated fat is associated with an increased risk of coronary heart disease or cardiovascular disease." Now, their analysis also showed that as the percentage of the diet consisting of carbohydrates increased, so did the percentage of small dense or type B pattern LDL. Because when you remove the fat from the diet, you have to replace it with something. It's a zero-sum game. A more recent meta-analysis examined over 500,000 people in 32 different trials and concluded, and I quote, "Current evidence does not clearly support cardiovascular guidelines that encourage high consumption of polyunsaturated fatty acids and low consumption of total saturated fats," end quote. Why? Because again, when you take the saturated fat out and people replaced it with polyunsaturated fatty acids, they did it with the common vegetable oils that we use: corn, safflower, sunflower, soy. These are predominantly composed of omega-6 polyunsaturated fatty acids. Replacing saturated fat with vegetable oils that are rich in omega-6 polyunsaturated fatty acids, according to several studies and another meta-analysis, can actually increase your risk of death. This was seen when they did a re-examination of the Sydney heart trial results. We have to remember that omega-6 polyunsaturated fatty acids contribute to the generation of the pro-inflammatory pathway. And this pathway exists in a dynamic equilibrium because of competition for the same enzyme substrates as the omega-3 anti-inflammatory pathway. So when you increase omega-6, it's like on a seesaw. If one goes up, the other must go down. So you increase the omega-6, you by definition are suppressing the production of omega-3 anti-inflammatory molecules. The single largest change in any food group in the last century has been the consumption of vegetable oils. Baked goods, which are a hidden source, a huge hidden source of these types of oils, salad dressings, condiments, now account for the largest contribution of fat in the modern Western diet. It's actually not meat. Meat and poultry is second. To give you an idea of the magnitude, in 1900, consumption of these oils was essentially zero. Today, it's over 8% of the total energy found in the modern Western diet. Such consumption patterns are associated with the increased risk of cancer, increased oxidized LDL, and remember, it's the oxidized LDL that plays that critical role in the inflammatory pathway and the development of atherosclerosis. Reduced HDL, and not a big surprise, increased level cardiovascular events. Now, as an interesting aside, in a lot of these replacement studies when they were carried out, there was an increased risk of suicide or violent death in the groups that were taking the omega-6 rich polyunsaturated fatty acid oil supplementation. It was of such concern that in the 80s, the National Institute of Health secured some scientists and researchers to look into what they termed these side effects. Best consensus today is that there actually may have been some psychological problems as a result of changes to brain chemistry caused by fatty acid imbalances. Now, if we replace the saturated fats with carbohydrates, especially the refined carbohydrates, we likewise get worse outcomes. Increase, as we've talked about, in the type B or small dense LDL pattern, lower HDL, and increase in something that we all see clinically today, obesity, diabetes, and their associated complications. So is it really any surprise that when we look closely, we see that 75% of the people who come in with an acute myocardial infarction their LDL cholesterol is actually already in the desirable range. And this study was done at a time when those guidelines suggested 100 to 130 milligrams per deciliter. But even if we take a more modern, rigorous standard of 100 milligrams per deciliter, what do we see? We see that almost half of our patients are coming in with their cholesterol already where we want it. But about a third of these patients will have overt diabetes, and many, many more will have metabolic syndrome. And that underscores the importance of these metabolic abnormalities in the etiology and genesis of this disease. This whole distraction really results in what I term the dietary cholesterol fantasy. It's the idea that the cholesterol that you eat in your diet is directly related to your blood lipid level. But we have to understand cholesterol is one of the most important molecules in the body. As such, there are three distinct pools for it. There's the cholesterol that you eat, which, by the way, actually has to undergo extensive modification because the cholesterol found in food is very poorly absorbed from the GI tract. Again, such an important molecule that there's a reclamation pathway, again, through the gastrointestinal tract. And then there's de novo synthesis in the liver, very complex, involving over 30 different steps. In other words, the cholesterol you eat has little to no impact on your blood lipid profile. The 2015 guidelines acknowledge this by removing all cholesterol restrictions. But back in 1999, the AHA was still telling folks to reach for soft drinks to make sure you don't get fat. In 2001, we were telling folks, hey, you know what? Grab a gumdrop or some other hard candy made primarily from highly refined sugar to quench that craving for a fatty snack. So is it any wonder that the general public and a lot of us are still so confused? Despite these ineffectual changes that occur trying to limit dietary cholesterol intake or replace the saturated fat, and the confusion about all the guidelines and recommendations that are constantly changing, the fact remains that dietary choices are extremely powerful. If we compare an isocaloric, low-fat versus a low-carb diet, so the energy is the same, the calories are exactly the same, all we've done is have differing amounts. One has more fat, one has more carbs. When we reduce the carbs, we see less body fat, we see less triglycerides, less risk of diabetes, and perhaps most importantly, we see a reduction in a number of markers of inflammation. And you get to eat more fat. There's an increase in HDL. And as we have shown and discussed previously, a decrease, a reduction in small, dense, or type B LDL patterns. Did I mention that you get to eat more fat? Which from a culinary and cook's perspective is all about flavor. Now the Mediterranean diet and Mediterranean approach has been examined in a number of trials. The PREDIMED group out of Europe has done extensive and a whole lot of very good research on this. One of their early trials where they actually compared the Mediterranean diet, the Mediterranean approach, to the low-fat diet, which was what was recommended at the time, they found that there was a 30% reduction in cardiovascular endpoints in favor of the Mediterranean diet. This was so powerful that the trial was actually stopped early, and it's on par, if not in excess, of the benefits that we see by giving people statin medications. Now, additionally, following such an approach, when they compare the Mediterranean approach to the modern Western diet, it's been shown to prevent diabetes and in certain individuals actually reverse diabetes. All this while consuming, I might add, more fat than is found in the standard American diet. The Mediterranean diet actually has more fat as a percentage than the standard American diet. But one of the cornerstones of the Mediterranean approach is its emphasis on fresh, wholesome, and very often local acquisition of foods. One of the main differences between diets of populations that are healthy and populations like what we see in the United States or where people consume the modern Western diet has to do with the quality of the comestibles. If we apply this approach to one of my favorite cooking ingredients, the spring of satisfying fatty goodness, we see that with respect to meat options, not all meat is created equal. And so now it's time to serve your little red meat. A meta-analysis was done at Harvard University that examined 20 studies, over 1.2 million people worldwide. And it was a very important study because it was one of the first studies to look in depth, in a detailed way, the difference between fresh red meat and processed meat-like products. Consuming 4 ounces per day of fresh beef, pork, or lamb, their definition of red meat, yielded no increased risk of cardiovascular disease or diabetes. But just 2 ounces a day of highly processed meat increased your risk of diabetes by almost 20% and your risk of cardiovascular disease by over 40%. Now, of note, if we can look at the chart up here, if you look under cholesterol, just right there, you'll see that it is actually higher in the fresh meat, which goes along with what we have just been talking about, and it's consistent with the other data showing that the dietary cholesterol does not translate into diabetes, cardiovascular disease, other diseases of inflammation. Also, I will point out down here in the nitrate, you'll see that these are essentially the same, dispelling the nitrate-nitrite myth, which is a whole nother talk. Happy to come back and do that another time. But very importantly, you see the nitrosamines are essentially the same. What is different is the potassium to sodium ratio. If we look at the fresh red meat, we see that that sodium to potassium ratio is less than 1. If we look at the processed meat, we see it as almost 3. This is a consistent finding in any number and the vast majority of processed and refined foods. It's a consequence of how we process and refine our foods. And in a number of other studies, an increased sodium to potassium ratio as opposed to the absolute amount of sodium has been shown to correlate with the development of a number of cardiovascular conditions. The EPIC trial was a prospective trial. It looked at over 500,000 people in 10 different European countries for over a decade. They found no increased risk for cancer, cardiovascular disease, or early mortality at any level of fresh red meat consumption. However, in concert with the data from the meta-analysis of Harvard, they found for every 50 grams of processed meat, you increased your risk of early mortality by over 20%, increased your risk of cardiovascular disease by 30%, and it increased your risk of cancer by over 10%. So based on this type of data, the World Health Organization recently labeled processed red meat a carcinogen. This was not the case for fresh red meat or unprocessed red meat. I also want to note that the World Health Organization labeled glyphosate as a probable human carcinogen. That is the active component in Roundup. This occurred despite some decades of us being told that it's totally safe. As humans, we don't have to worry about it because it acts on the shingomate pathway, which is a plant-only pathway, which we don't have, obviously. Unfortunately, they then have found it in the body fluids of migrant workers who've been exposed to it in the fields. And the problem with this is actually it's not the GMO alterations of the corn, the soy, and the canola, the vast majority of which in this country is grown as a GMO. But in the growing process, the GMO makes these plants resistant to Roundup. So you can basically grow them in a pool of Roundup where they don't have any competition from other plants. The end result is that we can consume that directly, but also don't forget that these types of plants are very often used in animal feed, which can get into the food pathway at that juncture. So how do we go from carnivory and red meat propelling us to the summit of sentience, the top of the world, king of the world, to having feet of ground beef, if not clay? Well, we change the equation. With the onset of the Industrial Revolution, in particular over the last 50, 75 years, there have been huge changes to our food and food pathways, like the GMOs that we just mentioned. The result is a modern Western diet with components like processed red meat. Now, within only the last decade, in particular really the last 5 years, quickly emerging as a critical part, a critical player in setting us up for health or wellness or leading us down the path to disability and disease is the gut microbiome. So the question is, the missing link, our very own minions. Because remember, as we talked about at the very beginning, you never, ever, ever dine alone. The gut microbiome with 100 trillion bacteria is there with you at every meal. Everything you eat is subject to co-metabolism. Every bite is a dinner party. And like a dinner party, the success or failure depends not only on the food, but the guests. Because what we eat affects us two ways. First, obviously, it directly impacts us through absorption, but it also impacts our gut microbiome. And the impact of the gut microbiome we're learning is so profound, we really now have to start considering it a symbiotic endocrine organ. Time's wrapping up, so I want to hit some key points because we're kind of precluded from an in-depth discussion. The gut microbiome really is its own separate lecture. But dietary modification in the way we choose, what we choose to eat, can impact the character and the composition of the gut microbiome. And in some studies, this can occur as rapidly as one day. For an example, there are mice that are called germ-free mice. They have no gut microbiome. You can feed them many more calories than conventional mice or obese mice, and these mice will stay very lean. But mice have a habit, which is useful for the research scientists, of liking to eat each other's poop. So you can take the mice with no gut microbiome and give them, in essence, a fecal transplant. So you seed their gut microbiome with the poop from the obese mice. Those mice then become obese. So we've just shown, at least in a mouse model, that obesity is a transmissible phenotypic trait, which does, by the way, fulfill one of Koch's postulates for infectious disease. And certain bacteria make certain products. Certain bacteria will make a compound known as trimethylamine, or TMA. This in and of itself is of little consequence, but in certain species, mice and in humans, we uptake this compound, and in our livers using hepatic flavin monooxygenase 3 enzyme pathway, we convert TMA into TMAO, or trimethylamine N oxide. This actually has correlated with risk for cardiovascular disease and is found in elevated levels in people who suffer from diabetes and chronic kidney disease. There is a naturally occurring, non-lethal competitive inhibitor to the substrate that bacteria use for this pathway called 3,3-dimethylone-butanol, or it's my personal moniker, DMB. It's something that I can remember. Now, you can block this pathway, obviously in people, much as we block the hepatic pathway for cholesterol synthesis using our statins and interrupting the HMG-CoA reductase inhibitor pathway. And we can see the effect of this because some people are born with a genetic anomaly, a genetic mutation, in which this enzyme doesn't work. And they, in fact, have very low levels of TMAO. Unfortunately, they get a buildup of TMA. And the buildup of these amines, another creative name for a syndrome, they suffer from fish odor syndrome. They smell like week old mackerel. When you add the pharmacologic agent, you also induce hepatic inflammation. So one can see up front, this is going to be a pretty tough marketing sell. But DMB is found naturally in certain fermented foods. Red wine, certain virgin olive oils, certain balsamic vinegars. Any aspiring culinary people here? Does this sound like the ingredient palette for maybe the Mediterranean diet? So what they did was they fed the DMB to mice, and in a mouse model, they significantly reduced the development of aortic atherosclerotic lesions. So just feeding them the DMB found in these fermented foods reduced atherosclerosis, and it did it without changing their lipid blood profile, their lipid cholesterol levels without changing that one iota. What did change were the quantitative and qualitative components of the gut microbiome. In essence, they ate certain foods and created a new microenvironment, one in which beneficial bacteria thrived, the population of pathogenic bacteria declined. Guys, it's like Napa Valley. Anybody familiar with Napa Valley? Been there, enjoy a glass of wine? Okay, microclimates. Certain grapes grow in one environment, not another, but all contained within Napa Valley. And in the interest of time, I will skip a few slides here. And I want to leave you with a couple of quick caveats. As we move forward now, we really have to expand our viewpoint. We are dealing, when it comes to food and health, with metagenomics, right? We've got to incorporate nutrition. We've got to incorporate physiology. We've got to incorporate genetics. There's the whole aspect of the human-food interaction. There's a whole aspect of the gut microbiome-food interaction. The first biome that the food you eat comes into interaction with is the gut microbiome. It starts in your mouth. And this is an undiscovered country. It's an unknown universe. We haven't even begun to account for the fungi, the yeast, the viruses that will no doubt play a role. Only about 30% of the bacteria in the gut microbiome can be cultured. We're using other techniques to try to identify them. And we must remember that when we look at this complicated picture, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Just because we don't see something yet, we cannot exclude it. And by necessity, a lot of the data, particularly the human data and the human diet data, is observational, which makes the results corollary. And as I said before, we've got to understand that correlation is not causation. So the takeaways: evolution supports our red meat cravings. It was carnivory, along with fire, that propelled us to our current status as the most dominant species on the planet. And as a reflection of that contribution and its import, we can take some solace in that the new guidelines, over half a century later, are finally starting to acknowledge that. Dietary cholesterol does not equal serum lipid levels. It does not correlate to disease risk. Saturated fats, they're a huge class. It's broad. It's got many categories and constituents. These fats are like people. We will have to examine them on their individual merits and perhaps observe them in the company that they keep. And finally, all meat is not equal. We know that red meat consumption, avoiding the processed offerings, does not seem to confer any cardiovascular risk, any cancer risk, or any risk of early mortality. But inherent in this, even though it appears to be from these risk factors diet neutral, inherent in this is a very unanswered question. The meat that was studied and observed, and particularly in the studies conducted in the United States, while fresh and unprocessed, was for the most part the result of CAFOs, or confined animal feeding operations. So my question moving forward is, will we see actual health benefits when we return to consuming the type of meat that got us out of the treetops and into our modern age? Because, colleagues and friends, we really need to start thinking about what kind of world we'll be leaving for Keith Richards. Thanks so much for your attention.
Wow, a lot to think about. Great talk, and we have 10 minutes for questions. I'm sure there are several, so Ike, I'll hand them.
Would you comment on the effects on the gut microbiome of treating red meat or chicken with antibiotics?
Yeah, well, interesting. The effect on the gut microbiome with antibiotics, and actually in some studies with GMO feed, actually starts with the chicken. So it's been shown that there in some studies that antibiotic treatment and GMO feed can actually raise levels of pathogenic bacteria, like in chickens, for example, Shigella. So by definition now you're dealing with a much more unhealthy bird. And I might add too that many of the rearing methods, can induce chronic stress in these animals. Chronic stress has been shown to affect our gut microbiome. There are a whole lot of things besides diet that can affect our, okay, it's time for me to stop talking. In fact, our gut microbiome beyond food, which includes stress, even traveling time zones, etc. So that plays a huge role. One of the dangers of antibiotics, which I don't know if you know this, the 80% of the antibiotics in this country are actually used in the animal feed industry, not for people. Everybody's worried about, in the hospital that you're going to get antibiotic resistant stuff. We're breeding it, and it is escaping through the use of microbial cassettes, which essentially is like Twitter for bugs. So microbiome, they have these antibiotic resistant cassettes, and you can one bacteria will tweet it to another species of bacteria, and all of a sudden they're resistant to the antibiotics. And these, for example, have been found in the Chesapeake Bay in soil bacteria when the origin were poultry farms in the middle of Virginia. So big, big, big problem.
Very interesting talk. Thank you
you
very much. So you mentioned causality and correlation and so on and so forth. The newer drugs that are coming out there are designed to lower LDL cholesterol, the PCSK9 inhibitors will dramatically drop LDL levels. Although we don't have end result outcomes on those studies yet, what's your prediction then in terms of dropping dramatically LDL and these new drugs? I mean, would you associate then, if there's evidence that mortality is reduced, that LDL is a stronger component then, as opposed to just diet?
Well, and that's a great question. And so let me make a distinction. I don't think you can look at, the histological sections of atherosclerotic lesions and say that, cholesterol doesn't play a role. It certainly does. Whether we understand the pathway and we think we have it nailed down versus there's a lot more to learn. Obviously, they've actually found within the same lesions that there is cholesterol through extraction of actual lesions. They have found bacterial DNA of bacteria that only live in the gut. And that's found in the extracted from coronary lesions. So there clearly are bits and pieces that we still have not found. The reduction with LDL from the PCSK9 inhibitor is very dramatic. It seems like they will also have a mortality benefit. Don't forget, we see a mortality benefit with statins. They're in the guidelines, but statins clearly have an anti-inflammatory component to them, right? So we knew this from the very first trials, because you gave somebody a statin when they presented versus 48 to 72 hours when they left, and there was a mortality difference. That is way too early for it to have any impact on the LDL cholesterol level. So there are powerful ancillary components to statins. We don't know all the effects of these drugs as well. Very interesting, the PCSK9 inhibitors were actually developed off a human mutation. So when we've looked, again, I've mentioned how important cholesterol is. When we look at some genetic conditions where you can't synthesize cholesterol, it's associated with mental retardation, body part deformities, all sorts of handicaps. They were able to identify this PCSK9 mutation in people that had college degrees, had families so they weren't sterile. And actually that's where this drug was engineered from.
A lot about probiotics in the last month. We've got microbiome in the last month. And what do you think about probiotics? And do we know enough about acidophilus, lactobacillus, and the things that we try to supplement with after antibiotics potentially to reestablish that gut microbiome?
Another great question. I think that we're in the right direction. I think we just suffer from a huge knowledge gap, a knowledge deficit. Even some of the more intricate probiotics, only supplying a fraction of the types of bacteria that are in there. And so where I think that is a positive step, number one, it's not a complete replacement for the gut microbiome as we know it. Two, we're then missing possible bacteria-to-bacteria interactions. And 3, we also have to understand that it's, we're always looking for a magic bullet and a quick fix. Take these probiotics, they sell them all over the place, for intestinal immune health, all over the television. And then nobody takes any prebiotics, right? If they're like sea monkeys, if you have them, you got to feed them. And so, people take probiotics and then go through the drive-through with a takeaway bag on the other hand. And that's not, properly cultivating your inner garden, as it were.
Yeah, I tell my patients that, just as you said, 30 or 40% maybe of the colonic bacteria can be grown. The rest of them we can't grow. And so probiotics, by definition, are not going to have any of those, which are so important in the entire milieu. Well, this has just been
So most of the research with the omega-6 fats, with the inflammatory cascade, are done in mice. They haven't done too many in humans. So what's your prediction for, where that research is going to go and when we can start using that as actual evidence-based medicine in humans?
I think that you can. If you look at a lot of the studies, and again, observational studies, what you'll find, again, is a reduction in these diseases that seem to have an inflammatory root in dietary approaches where there is a much less consumption of the omega-6 polyunsaturated fatty acids and more intake in the omega-3s. And that's, again, one of the questions, when you look at, for example, free-range, completely grass-fed, pastured beef, what do you find? You find it's very high in omega-3s. It virtually doesn't exist in the industrially produced. So again, a huge difference there. One study I came across about 2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago, that I thought was fascinating, nobody talked about it, was that when they were raising the salmon with the aquaculture and keeping them in the pens, they saw a huge plummet in the omega-3s, which is, of course, why every cardiologist tells the patient, go out and have a salmon, not a steak. But a huge plummet in the omega-3s, and then an increase in the rise. So their profile actually resembled more a mega market steak. So I think you can use that data. It is there. It is observational. The confirmatory science is, sort of in the animal models, and we're just limited because we can only observe. If we think that something's detrimental, you don't want to do a study where you're putting people and patients at risk. And so that is one of the limitations in dealing with that. But, I certainly recommend, diets and things that are rich in omega-3s. I don't know if you saw a study came out actually yesterday looking at omega-3 supplementation and showing that it may reduce recurrent heart attacks, reduce mortality. The caveat, it was retrospective, it was observational, a little over 11,000 patients. And the researchers had a financial stake in making omega-3 supplements. So we always have to look a little more carefully when that's the case. Thank you.
Okay, anybody have any other questions? Just come on up and ask them personally then. Thanks everybody for your attention.
Thank you.